Gerry, I've known, wow, all the way back to Mind Commerce days over a decade ago. Time
That's true.
flies. How are you, Gerry?
Very good. How are you?
I'm good, thank you. So over to you, Gerry.
Okay, let's just jump right in.
Yeah.
So, the talk today is about realizing the benefits of business identity for optimal consumer contact. And just a little bit of background about caller ID reputation. We provide visibility into what's actually happening when enterprise place calls, meaning that we provide view into whether the call goes through as normal or whether it is blocked or whether it has some type of flagging like spam or scam likely or something like that. So the discussion today is how do we navigate the various regulatory issues and the various challenges with call delivery while at the same time optimizing from a UI UX perspective the consumer so that ideally they answer the call and they have a good experience with the business that's calling them. So the status as it is today is roughly 30% or as much as a third of legitimate business numbers are affected in some way, shape, or form. And that could be either through blocking or adverse labeling, as I mentioned. And this is largely driven by the algorithms with the analytics engines, which we're going to talk a little bit about
Yeah.
later in this slide deck. So the primary challenges we have here, as I mentioned, blocking and labeling. And really what's
Oh,
driving this is,
just a minute. Are you sharing some slides? Because I just see.
yes. Oh,
Okay,
yes.
yeah. Press click. Yeah, that's it. Press share, and then wherever you're
Oh,
presenting them from.
all right.
Because it
Sorry.
sounded like you were running through some slides. I was like, oh, we're not seeing the slides.
Oh, yeah. Sorry. I was. I thought I was sharing my screen. Hold on one second.
No worries. Yeah,
Uh,
because this is an interesting and evolving area. For example, T-Mobile has made some improvements. So when calls come through, because I'm a T-Mobile customer, I no longer have spam likely for half the calls. So they've because it means in saying spam likely, then don't send it to me. But the other one, and I think Google sorted its labeling out. So I see it's a Google call. There you go. But because it says Google, I'm like, but is this spam? Is it real? Because there's no like marks or authentication. And well, if it's Google, then it's most really going to be a sales call. So I ignore it anyway.
yeah. So you can definitely relate, and a lot of people can relate. Thanks for catching that. I
No problem.
inadvertently wasn't slide sharing. So here's the slide I was just talking about. Um, on the left-hand side, we see many of the issues that you were just referring to, Alan.
Yep.
And then the right-hand side, this is really what's driving it from the fraud perspective.
Yeah.
Forms of fraud are telephone number spoofing and
Yeah.
brand impersonation.
Yeah.
And these are the kind of things that we've all experienced. Brand impersonation is somebody saying that they are a brand, but they're really not. All kinds of different scams are out there, like
Yeah.
the package delivery scam claiming to be FedEx or something like that.
Yep.
On the telephone number spoofing, this is basically where somebody is using a telephone number without permission. Now, telephone number spoofing in and of itself, at least in the United States, is not illegal. When it becomes illegal is when it violates the Truth in Caller ID Act,
Yeah.
which roughly says that the calling party is attempting to steal something of monetary value or otherwise harming. And so one of the measures that we look at when we look into this type of thing is what is the context? And generally speaking, if somebody's spoofing, let's say a bank's number, they typically don't have good intent. Um, it is possible to spoof calling name, for example.
Hmm.
As a consumer, you can go in and change the CNAM, the calling name
Yeah.
that you use that would be displayed. A typical ethical reason for doing that might be, let's say you're on a family plan and you don't want everybody in your family to have the name information show up that is the primary account holder. Like myself, for example, it would show up as Gerry Christensen for myself and also the rest of my family. I could change that for other telephone numbers on the plan so it shows up appropriately. But guess what? You could also go in there and change it to something really strange or maybe even misleading. So again, it's not illegal to do these types of things unless it's used for ill intent. And so the tricky thing is trying to figure out that intent, which we're going to get
Yeah.
to in a minute. This is a slide that I like to use to illustrate all the different compliance issues that are out there. Now, a moment ago, we were talking about outright fraud, but what this deals with is many of the compliance things, such as the Federal Trade Commission's telemarketing sales rule, the federal do not call list, the TCPA, and all of these things really get to the issue of consent. And as a point of information, in January of next year, the FCC ruling for consent is going to take effect. And what that says is for telemarketers and telesales is the primary target here. When you buy lists, you need to make sure that they are on a one-to-one express written consent basis. The way that telemarketers have been historically doing things, not in all cases, but in some cases, they will buy lists, and that may be as a result of somebody going to a website, opting in perhaps, but maybe not reading the fine print, not realizing they're going to get called by a whole bunch of different companies potentially.
Exactly.
That's going to change. And so come January, it has to be on a one-to-one basis. So when you go to a website and you see the particular product offering and the particular company that's making that offer, you will opt in, and then you should expect to only hear from them. You should not be hearing from anybody else. There's another provision to it as well, which is that the subsequent telemarketing telesales must be on a logical and topical basis. So an example might be, let's say you sign up because you're interested in hearing more about lawnmowers because you need to replace your lawnmower. If all of a sudden you start getting calls about a new roof for your home, that is most likely in violation because you didn't sign up for receiving that. Plus, the other thing is you should be hearing from the same company and not a different company. Now, one of the things that's important to note here, Alan, is most likely there's going to be some legal precedent set on this logical and topical type of thing because right now it's highly subjective. The FCC uses these words, logical and topical, but they don't give examples like I just gave. And so there's probably going to have to be some legal precedent here. So we'll see what happens.
Well, the lawyers need to make some money.
Absolutely. But the main thing is here, there's going to be increasing scrutiny in terms of consumer contact, and more specifically as it pertains to consent, which I think in the long term is a good thing because it'll elevate the value of consumer contact and make it better for everybody. Because at the end of the day, we're putting these platforms together, CPaaS, UCaaS, CCaaS, because we want to have a sustainable business model and we don't want people breaking the rules.
Exactly.
All right, so here's an example of this type of challenge. And I actually experienced this myself earlier this year. I was traveling. I went to the grocery store. I was actually traveling with my wife. She used our debit card. It failed. We had to use a different credit card at the grocery store. And then a few minutes later, I was driving over a bridge, couldn't answer the phone, but I got a screen grab from what was left behind when they left a message. Sure enough, it was my bank, but look what it says there, potential spam. So that was my bank calling me to see if it really was me or if it was a fraudulent attempt to use my debit card. So that's a perfect example.
Oh, yeah. Well, it could have been the president offering you vice presidency.
I get a lot. I'm sure you get a lot of those text messages this time. But this was a voice call, and I'm not sure if I would have answered it anyway. It was followed up by text message, by the way, Alan.
Okay. Yes, exactly.
And so that confirmed the first contact attempt, which was the voice call, and I contacted them and sorted it out. But perfect example. And so who's affected by this? And we refer to this as false positives, by the way. In the statistics, a false positive is basically you're measuring something, you're looking for something, and you believe that you found it, but you're wrong. That's a false positive. So in this case, the analytics engines believe that previous number, for whatever reason, that 833-735-1894 number was spam. And who knows why? I mean, it could have been because of the frequency of calls, or maybe it had never placed calls before, or perhaps the MPA NXX combination of my number and that number. And what they do is they have proprietary algorithms. And they're not going to tell you exactly why. But so who's affected here? A lot of large consumer-facing enterprises, financial services, healthcare, et cetera, et cetera. It's actually a big problem for legitimate businesses.
Yeah, it is.
And these numbers illustrate that. And so consumers think unidentified calls are fraudulent 92% of the time. And for those that, go unanswered, about 46%. And so I'm not going to read through the rest of this, but it continues to be a big problem. This is the balance that we're dealing with. On one side, we want to protect consumers, but legitimate businesses are affected as well.
Yeah.
And so, as I alluded to, these false positives, they come from the terminating side, the terminating service provider. The TSPs are most likely going to be the large carriers because they have the preponderance of the market: AT&T, T-Mobile, and Verizon, and their respective analytics engines providers. And this is not to throw them underneath the bus, because I would say, generally speaking, from protective services perspective, First Reliant, High, and TNS, which support those carriers, they're doing a great job protecting consumers. And here's some examples of what we see: potential spam as opposed to the regular number. And so we also get some feeds from the over-the-top based app providers as well. And so that could be Nemo, RoboKiller, et cetera, et cetera. Altogether, this gives us an idea of what's actually going on with respect to how these companies score a particular telephone number.
Yeah.
So how do we stop this from happening? And the stopping here is this mislabeling, is what I'm referring to. How we stop it, it really starts with business identity. And so business identity is going to be things like all the things that you would do from a know your customer perspective. And by the way, in my definition of know your customer, it's not just a single vetting event, it's ongoing vetting, and it's really even ongoing monitoring. And by ongoing monitoring, it's many of the things that we do as a company, which is we see how the calls show up, we see how the analytics engines view the companies. And by the way, one of the things we use is Honeypots too, so we can see if there's any calls from these telephone numbers that would indicate something that's breaking a regulation. But again, back to identity, the vetting is really important, because if we know, for example, that you are a bank, and then we see something that indicates something about a package delivery, that could be indicative of a spoofing event. And what we would do is we would let our customer know and give them some options to deal with that, et cetera, et cetera. It starts with business identity. And as this illustration shows, it's a bit of a continuum, because your identity is going to affect your reputation, which affects the call treatment. And again, that goes back to business identity, which is why ongoing monitoring is so important.
Just a quick question. So I'm a valid business, and some fraudster is spoofing my number. How do you deal with that situation?
Well, in the short term, you deal with it just by being aware of it and letting your folks know that it's happening, because that will definitely generate inbound complaints. And so a call center may be confused, like, what are you talking about, et cetera, et cetera. Another way to deal with that on a short-term basis is to change telephone numbers. Now, I'm not a big advocate of telephone number rotation, because I think that actually makes this problem even bigger, because it's kind of like chasing your tail. But on a short-term basis, I think that would be prudent, because if your number's being spoofed, you don't want to keep doing that. Now, spoofing is very ephemeral. It's very, it's like a Zen kind of thing. It's very short-term. It's going to happen for maybe an hour, maybe even minutes. But still, you don't want to be using a number you know is being spoofed. Longer term, what can be done is to potentially do a traceback to determine who the bad actor is in this case, and to see if you can root them out and get them out of the network. And so that would be an option. And the industry traceback group, the ITG, does a fantastic job at this. And I would say they're kind of the gold standard in terms of determining who the bad actors are and getting rid of them. So I highly recommend working with them. There are some other options as well. One could potentially work directly with carriers, and the carriers could look at their networks and see, oh, I got a call to this particular telephone number from this other number that comes from this other upstream carrier. And then maybe they could do something about it, maybe even turn them off. Now, that's a viable option. However, it's not turning it off at the source, as is the case with ITG, which is why they are kind of the gold standard. All right, so let's move on then. So It all starts with registration, because if we're going to identify that you have spoofing, we have to know your telephone numbers. So if you register your telephone numbers, including your do not originate numbers, your DNO numbers, which
Yeah.
would be any telephone number that perhaps you use for inbound calls, but they never place calls.
Yeah.
And by the way, the bad actors, if they can discover those, they will definitely abuse that.
Yeah.
And one of the things that bad actors try to do is, if they could spoof your numbers, they realize that it could actually show up as CNAM, the call and name identity, on the terminating service provider as the legitimate business. And that would be really bad, because it would add credibility to
Yeah.
that bad actor call. So again, this is a really good reason for registering your numbers, because we can identify when spoofing occurs. We can identify it on the basis of context, as I alluded to earlier,
Yeah.
like banks don't call about packaging
Yeah.
delivery. Another way we can identify it is through the stir shaken data. If you register your telephone numbers, and one of the ways that you can work with caller ID reputation is you can place calls directly to us. When you do that, we can see the stir shaken data, including the credentials and also the attestation level. Now, we know that can change over time because of least cost routing,
Yeah.
but at least you can establish a baseline, and we can see what those credentials look like, so that on an ongoing basis, if we see any calls that don't have those credentials, again, a highly likely spoofing event, so that we can trigger action.
Okay.
One of the solutions longer term, and folks talk about this all the time, we're really kind of in the crawling stage here with branded calling, arguably, even in its current proprietary way of doing it in the United States, with companies like TNS and Newstar and First Orion.
Yeah.
This is what we believe in the industry is going to root out the bad stuff. The good pushes out the bad kind of thing. There's another way of doing it, which is the rich call data based
Yeah.
way, and CIA is leading that effort. They both have advantages and disadvantages. The way branded calling is done today uses a non-standard method, as I was mentioning, and what it relies on is out-of-band signaling and a means of authentication to let the terminating service provider know that an inbound call is trusted, meaning that it actually came from the OSP, the originating service provider.
Mm-hmm.
And the reason why you want to do that is because, like, one of the worst things you could possibly do is to provide a branded calling experience when it's a bad actor, when it's somebody that's spoofing that has nefarious intent. The way that RCD-based branded calling does it is it relies on stir shaken, and more specifically, getting A-level attestation. So one of the downsides there is, if you can't get A-level attestation all the way to the terminating service provider, then you can't do RCD-based branded calling.
Yeah.
And we know that stir shaken is not ubiquitous, because we know that IP is not ubiquitous.
Correct.
If you hit a TDM SS7 hole, you're going to lose it. So that's the challenge there.
And I'd also heard that A-level attestation has been, well, not hacked, but yeah, you can receive a call that claims via stir shaken A-level attestation, but it's not real.
You're absolutely right, Alan. I've heard some crazy stuff, and I won't name names.
Yeah.
One of the things that happened was very public about a company. What happened in New Hampshire. I don't need to go into details there.
Yeah.
But that was really a KYC issue and a misapplication of stir shaken. When I say misapplication of stir shaken, you're supposed to only apply A when you can associate the number and the network together. They could associate the network, but they couldn't associate the number with the network, but yet they still gave it A.
Gotcha.
And in a strictest sense, you shouldn't do that, no matter how well you think you know the company and what they're doing. And apparently they didn't know very well what they were doing. That's one thing I've heard. But the thing that's even crazier that I've heard, Alan, is I've heard that some intermediate network operators are getting an unsigned call because maybe it was stripped, those TDM SS7 holes, or for some other reason that they don't have attestation, and then they put an egg on it. And that is a major no-no.
Yeah.
And in fact, I would venture, I'm not a lawyer, disclaimer, and these are my opinions, not necessarily the opinions of the company I work for, and this is not legal advice, but I would say that anybody that's doing that is putting themselves in jeopardy, because not only are they not applying stir shaken appropriately, but they're putting anybody downstream in danger of being defrauded and willfully doing something that's just wrong. So I'm glad you asked that question.
Cool.
All right. So how do we verify this call treatment? How do we get these screenshots, because if I wasn't clear earlier, what we do is we get screenshots, we render them on a web-based portal. That's our SaaS-based offering. We also provide this on an API basis with a REST API or a webhook. But the question is, how do we do this? Well, we've got this thing called Device Cloud, where we literally have banks of telephones, thousands of them, in fact, in a data center. And what we do is we get letter of agency from our customers, which is the enterprise
Yeah.
that want to know what's going on with their calls. We place calls on their behalf. So you could think of this as legal, ethical spoofing, because we're literally taking their number, making calls over another network so that we can see what is displayed. And then for purposes of allowing only legitimate businesses to see this information and of course, optimize what's going on.
Yeah.
And this underscores our need for really good KYC, which we do, by the way, because we would never want to let a bad actor, somebody that's looking to defraud the public, get access to this kind of information, because that might help them in some way.
Yeah.
So this is what we do. We also monitor the call treatment. As I said, we have this way of allowing customers to also call us directly. So in that model, they don't need to give us a letter of agency because they are calling our numbers. And we don't do this with just anybody because we don't want to reveal our telephone numbers. We don't want to let the bad actors know what our numbers are because they might try to do a denial of service by calling them or some nonsense like that.
Yeah.
But for preferred customers, typically large enterprise, we'll divulge our numbers to them. We'll allow them to call us directly. And then we can get that stir shaking information that I mentioned earlier, which can be helpful from a monitoring perspective. We also, as I was alluding to when I was referring to the different analytics engines, including the OTT-based ones, we aggregate data from a variety of different sources, including Honeypots. So that way we can provide a full spectrum view as to why call treatment is happening. So for example, if it says scam likely, but then we look at the data and we don't see any evidence of a scam, what we would do, perhaps from a remediation perspective, is reach out to the analytics engines and say, hey, could you double check this, that you might have a false positive here, you might have an error. We don't have any reason to believe that this is fraudulent or a problem. We look at FTC data as well, complaints from people. We look at a variety of sources.
Gotcha. And how responsive are the analytics engines on updating?
Very, very responsive, actually. We've got a good track record. And when I say that, really what I'm referring to is we have a managed service for remediation.
Okay.
And so the turnaround time is really good. And I would say that that's because they know us, because we've been doing this for a long time. You're not necessarily going to get the same kind of turnaround doing it on a DIY basis. I mean, if you're a reputable company, you probably will get a pretty fast turnaround time. But I could just imagine if it's some not known telemarketing firm and you go to them, they may balk at it because they're not quite sure if they're on the up and up. This slide depicts what we refer to as sort of our sensor network, these various sources that I was referring to. Just an illustration. So auto monitoring, this is an important thing that we do. And in the lower right-hand corner, we look at RoboKiller data, we look at UMail, and we look at Honeypots. Now, it's important to recognize that, at least in my vernacular anyway, a honeypot is a number that a human being could never answer. In the case of UMail and RoboKiller, callers have plausible deniability that maybe they were trying to reach a customer that they legitimately have consent to call, presumably. But if you are systematically calling a honeypot, which is not assigned to anybody, and of course you could do a lookup on the reassigned number database, which is a database that contains numbers that have been left behind by somebody when they change carriers. They don't do porting for 90 days, but they're only in there for 90 days. But again, if you systematically call honeypot numbers, it's a high probability TCPA violation, or maybe you have a bad list that you bought or something like that. So that's why it's really important we look at this data.
Gotcha. Now, just one quick, because I've seen RoboKiller pop up a few times now. They've been bought by a private equity firm.
Correct. Bending Spoons.
Yeah, and I've not seen them publishing any data of late. So, I mean, at least UMail's still there, but I believe, I guess the company that bought them tends to get rid of everybody and then just wait until all the existing customers realize that the company isn't really providing what it wants provided. So I don't know whether you've got...
I've heard that through the grapevine as well. But I will also say at the same time that we have made contact with them. They are
Okay.
working with us and cooperating.
Okay.
So I'm hopeful that there will be an ongoing relationship there because
Gotcha.
the data they provide is valuable. I would
Yes.
say in many ways just as
Yeah.
valuable as email
Yeah.
and
Oh, yeah. Absolutely. Because
and, and
it hurt me because I quoted their data quite a few times, and then I was looking for the 2024 update, and there was nothing. And then
yeah,
that's when I started digging and discovering what had happened to them. But cool.
yeah, yeah, oh, yeah,
Understood.
yeah. I'm glad you brought that up. This is just an example of what we do with content-based analytics from Honeypots and from Umail and RoboKiller. In some cases, there's outright scams, and
Yeah.
this can be discerned by the context. Are they trying to get some money from you or steal your identity? And then other times, we're just looking at things to see, is there unlawful telemarketing? Like,
Yeah.
did they violate the telemarketing sales rule by not self-identifying themselves? By the way, that's the reason why the car warranty stuff was held to be,
Yeah.
you know, blockable because they don't say what company they're calling from.
Yeah.
I alluded to this earlier about remediation. On a DIY basis, our customers can see what's on the screen and work directly with the analytics engines, or they can have Caller ID Reputation do that on our behalf. That is a managed service. There's an extra cost there, but
Yeah.
many of our customers find that very valuable because we can literally fix things before they even realize there's a problem.
Yeah.
So in summary, the kinds of things that we believe are going to optimize contact and so therefore make your investment in CPaaS, UCaaS, CCaaS more valuable. You'll realize a full investment in it is to make sure that somebody's doing vetting on your behalf, which includes ongoing monitoring. I mentioned fraud earlier. There's the possibility of providing fraud alerts. And this would be an alert to let you know that we believe impersonations happened. And by the way, Alan, sometimes this requires further investigation. Sometimes it's painfully obvious, like banks don't call about package delivery.
Yeah.
But sometimes you might need to reach out to the bank and say, hey, was this really you? This looks plausible. Were you really offering a lower interest rate? And
Yeah.
they might say something like, well, we did have a campaign like that 2 or 3 months ago, but we're not currently doing that. So I think a bad actor is emulating a
Yeah.
legitimate campaign.
Yeah.
So sometimes it's not just an alert. Sometimes there's a need for some communication and a conversation.
Yeah.
And then finally, the remediation that we talked about, which is dealing with those false positives. And, this is a very balanced approach, I think, because on one hand, what we're looking to do is to optimize call delivery for our customers.
Yeah.
But we have internal governance. We watch our customers. So far, I haven't found anybody that's like outright fraud. And I really don't expect to because the bad guys don't want to register their numbers. But one of the things that will probably happen, again, especially once this January rule goes in place with the FCC, is there will be increasing scrutiny from a consent perspective.
Yeah.
And everything that I just went over with you, Alan, does not look at consent specifically, but we look at indicators of consent, like does it appear that you're calling numbers that are honeypot numbers,
Yeah.
So you might not have consent if you're doing that. We do have some other solutions that deal with risk mitigation when it comes to consent, but I don't have time to discuss that in this presentation. Maybe that'll be a future one. And then I left some time for Q&A. I didn't realize this format, whether or not you'd have live people that might, through the chat, have some questions. But I think I'm
We
probably out
did.
of
We
time.
did earlier. Well, yeah, we're just coming up on time. But I, I guess when I look at all these services, it seems something that like a big call center or a big business would use. Is this something that can, like small businesses or
Oh, yeah.
medium-sized businesses, what would you recommend in their case?
Oh, absolutely. And in fact, this is part of the disclosure of who we are as a company. Most of our customers are on the smaller side.
Oh, okay,
Yeah,
cool.
yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
Yeah, and I would say it's only the larger consumer-facing enterprises that are going to be the targets of brand impersonation and spoofing. Like literally, Joe the plumber is not going to be,
No, they just want people to answer their calls. That's the problem they're facing.
Exactly. That's exactly it. So like real estate agents, anybody that needs to reach people. So it doesn't have to be like a Fortune 500 company.
Gotcha.
And our plans kind of scale accordingly. So like if you just have a few telephone numbers, it's going to be more expensive on a per TN basis,
Yeah.
but it's going to be reasonably priced because, you
Yeah,
don't have
it's just a
2,000
few.
numbers.
Exactly. Cool. No, this was excellent, Gerry. Really good overview. You're in a nice position in the market, and the fact that you're trying to represent the customer, not pushing a particular technology. So again, it was a excellent perspective, and thanks so much for taking the time.
Oh, thanks for having me on.